Welcome to the Wednesday class that shall not be named. We're on YouTube now. Welcome to Lou, Karen, Michael, David, Paul, Eva, and Ron and Flossie and Arlene, or as we know Ron as the hand. Ron, there we go. There's the hand. Good morning again, Flossie.
Rabbi, a question.
Sure.
Rabbi, if we come up with a name for our class, would you still call us the class that will not be named?
If you guys can think of a name after 12 years, I think it's a good idea eventually to have a name.
In 12 years, boy, that passed by. Wow.
Yeah, my family, my parents had the same thing, and finally at 12, they said, we're going to call you Robert. So, you know, they eventually came up. It was nice of them. So today we were going to talk about Golda Meir, Menachem Begin, and Moshe Dayan. I realized that was just not going to work. There's no way we could get all three of them. We're going to try to get Golda and a little bit of Menachem Begin. I don't know if we'll get even that far because, again, Golda under herself is such an incredible woman. So I felt like, how do we push three in? So we'll save Moshe Dayan for later for sure if people want. And we'll go to Golda, and we'll get to Menachem Begin, of course, who is also, whether you're fans of these people or not, they lived very full lives and did an incredible amount. Some of you may even have met Golda Meir or Menachem Begin at times or heard them speak. I obviously was not so fortunate. I think, would you start speaking, Arlene, so we can see the thing?
Yeah, go ahead, Arlene.
Yeah, this is what happened after the 6-Day War. Our temple had a bond drive, and we bought a bond, and Golda Meir was the prime minister, and she signed. Of course, she's on there, so we never cashed it in, and we framed it. So there it is.
That is great. That is amazing. That is something she helped found was the bonds in the 50s. So very apropos that she signed it. By the way, cashing those things is almost as easy as breaking into Fort Knox. So the ones from the 60s, I tried to cash one just to see if it worked because it was my grandfather's bond, so it had to go from him and then to his widow, which would have been my grandmother who was already dead, then to my father, who was already then to my mother, and then to me. And I was like, that's too hard to get through all that. But the bonds themselves were essential in creating the economy and really in many ways helping to ensure that Israel survived in the 50s. And we'll talk a little about her because if she was not the person who had the idea or even the person who founded it, she is the one who really made those bonds go. So she is really the woman who helped do that. So we'll talk about Golda, who, again, when you say Golda, you're thinking of two people. You're thinking of Golda from Fiddle on the Roof or of Golda Meir. Certainly the most famous woman in Israeli history, maybe the most famous Jewish woman of the 20th century. One of the most famous Jewish women and certainly one of the most important of all time. You also have to think about her in terms of beyond the Jewish world. She became prime minister at a time where there had only been one head of state, I believe, in the world who had been a woman. That was Indira Gandhi in modern times, not counting like Cleopatra and in the ancient world. But still, as far as we've come in the world, there still has not been. There's, of course, been many more. Margaret Thatcher came soon after her, but those were really the three female leaders of countries for a very long time. Gandhi, Meir, and Thatcher, whether you liked them or not, those were basically the only three for a very long time. Of course, that has changed in recent times. Still not a lot of them, but obviously Germany's had a woman prime minister. There have been a few others around the world, but still a very small number. And in America, obviously, we've had one woman win the party's nomination. We've had one woman who has become vice president, but we still haven't had one here. So Golda Meir was Golda Mabovich, Obviously, as most Israeli leaders were, she came from Eastern Europe. Her upbringing was in probably Ukraine, Kiev, still part of Russia at the time. But even though she's from this area, obviously we know her more in many respects as an Israeli, but also as an American, because she moved to America when she was just a kid, around 5 years old, or her parents moved to America and she moved here a few years later. Her father moved to America, as was so often the case, found a job, goes to a smaller area, goes to Wisconsin or whatever, and then 2 years later, so brings the family. Golda is 5, 6, 7 years old, and she is living in, first in Canada for a bit, and then eventually gets to Milwaukee, where all great Israeli leaders, of course, are raised. There's 2 places to raise an Israeli leader: Jerusalem and Milwaukee. And she was in Milwaukee. So obviously her schooling and education is very different than those of her contemporaries in Israel, because even though she is Eastern European, she's Americanized because she grew up here and was very much a part of the American Jewish system, but also very dedicated to more than that. She was very dedicated at an early age to Jewish organizations, not just Israeli ones, but she was probably the first modern Jewish Zionist that was an American in many respects. Like, she grows up in America, kind of like any of us, even though she was born in Eastern Europe, and she goes to school. Obviously, there's issues with women's rights in America even at that time, but she's obviously very bright, as we all know. She's valedictorian. She's helping to run her parents' store before she's double digits. And she wants to go to college or study, wants to go get more education. And of course, what does her mother want for her?
A husband.
Marry a
A husband. Why are you wasting your time? Get married. I'm sure she was happy with her working, because of but she wanted her to have a husband, and her sister was married. Go live with your sister for a while, learn from her. And that also was because, when she's having issues. So she does start dating pretty early on her future husband. Of course, by this time, she has already been exposed to Zionism. So she starts dating her husband. She's not, she's 20, whatever she is. So she's a young woman when she starts dating her husband, even if she's 20. I don't know. So she's dating him, but she's already become a Zionist by this time. So it wasn't like she was a Zionist at birth. She was very dedicated to Jewish roots. She was raising money for organizations. And then she becomes part of Po'alei Zion, which is, becomes Habonim, which of course is the famous labor Zionist organization along with Young Judea. And even as she goes to college, she becomes a teacher. She's already becoming a Zionist. Unlike other Zionists, she is an American citizen too. So she becomes an American citizen and a Zionist. And she marries very young. She's 19, 20, or she gets engaged very young. And she had one requirement for marriage. And what was that requirement? Move to
Zionist.
Palestine. Not only is he a Zionist, move to Palestine. Obviously, that was not going to happen during World War I, but after World War I, she does, move to Israel. And she had been very much a part of this anti-Bund, anti-Zionist phase. And she's campaigning. We all know she's bright. She is outgoing. And she goes and moves to Israel, and they make friends, and they move to a kibbutz, and they do the usual thing, except that she is extraordinary. And everybody recognizes her leadership skills. So along with picking fruit and vegetables from trees and cooking and chasing chickens. She's part of the Histadrut and very quickly becomes a representative from her area for the labor organization, which of course is what is going to eventually turn into the Labor Party. So she's already getting to know people like Ben Gurion and all these other people we talked about. And by 1928, she's already secretary of the Women's Labor Organization. She goes back and forth to America. Why does she come to America so often?
Her family.
Family, but also to raise money. She speaks like an American. Her English is excellent. Her Yiddish is pretty good, I believe. She speaks a little Hebrew. She's going around and already starting to fundraise for the labor organizations. So this is a precursor to her, of course, coming and looking, promoting Israel after the war and raising money for various things, including the bonds. But she's already knows. So she is now, again, in pre-Israel Palestine, women were much more involved than they probably even were after the war. Because if you're part of the yeshuv or you're part of a kibbutz or you're part of the Labor Party, women are working with men. It is not a religious organization at all. So probably much more egalitarian, not completely as we obviously, but much more so than I would say most places on earth at that time. We're talking 1920s and 30s that women are working the land alongside men, defending their kibbutz alongside men. So she, though, is extraordinary in that she's actually moving up the ranks of the male-dominated leadership. So she becomes part of the executive committee of the Histadrut in the 30s. So, plus the fact that she is an American gives her connections or opportunities that not everybody has. She can come to the US and meet with President Roosevelt about Jews and issues in Europe. Now, she, of course, didn't get what she wanted. She's trying to get money for Israel, but she's also trying to get countries to accept Jewish refugees before World War II. And she did, unfortunately, she did get a lot of meetings, but very few countries were taking in Jews. The Dominican Republic was, I think, one of them. But she still was what we would call in America the representative of Israel to many Americans. Probably if your parents or my grandparents were alive, she would have been probably the most well-known representative, even maybe more so than Ben Gurion, because she was coming to America. He did too, but she's, basically could speak American. So she is part of the, along with the Yeshuv, she's part of the Jewish Agency, becomes a very big leader in the Jewish Agency, which again, she attends the UN partition plan meetings. She goes to Cyprus to visit internment camps and try and get them. She is everywhere and really promoting Israel from the inside and outside. So she's in executive leadership. She's promoting, she's representing, and she is also part of the fundraising arm of the Yeshuv. She even got to meet with King Abdullah. She did a lot on a level that few people have ever done, and certainly not a woman. And she's doing this all before Indira Gandhi was ever Prime Minister of India. So after and during the war, I'm talking not the World War II, but the Independence War for Israel, what does she do? She comes to America because obviously the Jewish Agency wants to raise money. And so she is their chief representative. And she comes to America and raises 4 times what they expect her to raise. I mean, she raises $30 million. She goes all over the city, all over the country. Probably our parents and grandparents heard her during this particular fundraising endeavor because it took several years for she go back and forth. And we all know how critical this money was, not only to the war effort, but the post-war efforts, because as you know, Israel did not have money in the 40s and 50s. You know, they were a very poor country, although very educated. So, and after spending a lot of money on a war, obviously you need more money for the starting of the government. So she was very high up. She was not given a spot in the cabinet after the war, but they were thinking about it, obviously, which was a very big honor, but she still was a woman. So, but even so, she was considered almost immediately for the cabinet. But she basically became the mother of Israel. That was kind of her role. The mother of you know, Israel was what she was, you know, and so what we also have to remember was, you know, she becomes prime minister in the, you know, and becomes part of the cabinet in the 50s. And she is not a healthy lady. This is a woman who smokes, who does not exercise, doesn't watch what she eats, has a heart attack, and, you know, at age 45, 50. So this is a woman who basically dedicates her life to Israel at the expense of her health. She also has kids that she does raise with a husband. Obviously, her connection to her husband over time kind of loosens because of her dedication to the country. And her kids, although they loved her, you know, she wasn't always around to raise them. So she really gave up a lot to do what she did, and that was to work nonstop. So she was the official mother of Israel. I think she was even called officially the mother of Tel Aviv. She was very, very much what we would call a Likud liberal, much more supportive of the Palestinians as they would become known in the West Bank and Gaza at the beginning. She is one of only 2 women to sign the Declaration of Independence. And of course, as soon as I said this, I remember that I was supposed to figure out who the other one was, and I just forgot. I never looked it up. So somebody can look that up. There was a second one, and I don't remember who it was. Okay, I just cannot. Oh, anyway.
Yeah.
Anybody find you got it?
Did Golda have a dual citizenship with the United States and Israel, or did she give up?
She did for a while, but I believe there's a clause that says if you become prime minister, you have to give up citizenship of another country. I don't remember if she gave it up before then, but I'm pretty sure I don't remember if that dual citizenship came up because of her, or I don't remember now, but I think she had to give it up to at least to become prime minister. But obviously, it was very important to have that citizenship so you could go back and forth very easily as a representative. So very soon, you know, after she became part of the government, after she, of course, went back to America and raised a lot of money, like a lot of money. This next time, we're talking about a third of the money that went to the war she raised herself personally. So that's an incredible amount. She was ambassador in many ways to the Soviet Union, which was key to helping Israel have good relations with them early on. And as we all remember, during the UN partition vote, the Soviet Union voted for partition and the support of Israel. Obviously, that connection between Israel and the Soviet Union would dissipate as they became much more close, as England left and they had opportunities with the Muslim countries. But she was very popular in Russia. She almost couldn't go anywhere, but not with the Jews, but also non-Jews. But she was very popular and helped cement that relationship. So when the government was finally and officially, after the first time, she finally was given her cabinet position. It's very interesting because the cabinet position she was given, she didn't like. So she told Ben-Gurion, I don't want that one. It doesn't have a defined role. So, so he made her labor minister, which is pretty funny because you think you're given a cabinet position, you're like, nah, I don't think I want that one. I want this one. And that was what she did, and she got what she wanted. So she was, she was labor minister, which of course was essential for the 1950s. Probably the most important cabinet ministry position, because what do you have going on in the 1950s? You got people coming to Israel from all over the place, and what do they need?
Jobs.
They need places to live. They need jobs. They need money. They need to be settled. That was her. So she is in charge of the settling of all of these people, made very difficult by lack of funds, people coming from all around the world, not speaking the same language, different religious persuasions within Judaism. And so she's also got to raise money for it, which of course is what she's been doing already. So she has to raise money and negotiate with America for loans, which she does. She helps secure the first loans. She helps create Israeli bonds, which are so important. And of course, does Israel get loans from America today? Yes, she was the one who helped start the first ones that continue today for billions of dollars, creating the policy that Israel would help pay back loans, cementing the relationship with Jews in America through the bonds. And so, and then in this time, she's also helping hundreds of thousands of Jews immigrate and settle. And so this is a very difficult thing because, you know, we think about the Indian Jews and the North African Jews and then Yemen, and how hard it was to get to Israel. We talk about the ways, but just as important as getting them is what did they do when they got there? I mean, they didn't have houses for them. You know, she had to set up all these temporary housing projects all over the country, and people were not happy with them because you might go from a home in India to a shack or an encampment in the desert of Israel. And you got to start hospitals and schools and start not only start hospitals and schools, but you got to set up how they're organized, the whole system. Plus you're dealing with socialism with a little bit of democracy. You've got to establish, you know, things like Social Security, and, you know, how do you help the people who are widows or children without parents? What do you do to bury people? And so this is what she is doing through the early 50s, which is the most important moment in terms of immigration to Israel, because you're setting the precedent. You got people who want to come to Israel from America and Europe, but that's a small number. You got a lot of people coming surviving the Holocaust. You got people who are kicked out of all the Muslim countries who have no idea about modern society at all. So it's a very difficult process. And plus, you know, she's not a healthy woman. So she's on the verge of a heart attack like all the time. And obviously she does live a lot longer, but you know, she lives to a pretty good age for that time period. But so, as we mentioned, Ben-Gurion steps down as prime minister. She actually had a good relationship with Moshe Sharett. There's a lot of issues that occur. Ben-Gurion comes back as prime minister after a 2-year absence, and he makes her foreign minister, which is a very big position. So in Israel, obviously prime minister is number one, but the two most important positions outside of prime minister are defense minister and foreign minister. Foreign minister is akin to secretary of state. So you have a woman secretary of state in the 1950s. Wow. Trying to meet with Muslim leaders and African leaders and European leaders. You have to imagine that she had to have a lot of charisma and carry herself very well, be able to control herself when she's obviously going to be snubbed or looked at or spoken in certain ways. So she's foreign minister for 10 years. You know, that's through the war for the Suez. That's through making treaties with anybody she could, surviving assassination attempts. So this is a woman who was very important to the formation of the state of Israel. She's also essential for, creating ways to help people in Israel survive and thrive. So it's not just about big government, it's about what are we doing for all the people. That's why she was kind of the mother of everybody. What are we going to do for not only widows and orphans, but for people who are emotionally troubled, for the elderly who can no longer work, for people who have trouble with the language. Excuse me. Any thoughts or questions so far? Did anybody ever actually meet her? Did you actually meet her, Arlene, by any chance?
No.
Well, Flossie.
I can't hear you.
Rabbi?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, Flossie, please.
Okay. I don't know if you remember, but Jeff brought supplies to Israel.
I do. Yeah. Did he meet her?
Well, that's what I wanted to say. The first plane into Israel was meeting Golda Meir. The third plane was Moshe Dayan. Jeff's luck, he was the second. He met Israeli flight attendants. And he was so frustrated. He said, I live with flight attendants knowing the job. So he came this close to meeting her, but the two didn't meet. I have a question. How did, with the Orthodox being the way they are, with women and men so separate, how did they accept a woman rising to this position and becoming prime minister?
It's a good question.
Not great. Not great. Now, you have to understand, as we talked about previously, the Orthodox were still not very politically active yet as much as they're going to become. That basically starts soon after her retirement as prime minister, really with Begin. So they were not, again, a woman in leadership position is never a good thing. The Orthodox today are much more politically active, much more anti-women than they were back then. It was, but still probably not great. But again, they were not as politically active. So it wasn't as much of an issue as it probably would be today in many respects.
Thank you.
But yeah, that was always an issue. But again, she dealt a lot of issues. Not only did she overcome heart attacks, and she ended up with cancer, and that of course forced her to retire from her position as foreign minister, and kind of she still served for the party, but her political career in many ways was going to end. She got cancer. However, this of course is Golda Meir. So she gets cancer, she beats it, and Levi Eshkol, who was the prime minister of Israel after Ben-Gurion steps down, the prime minister during the 6-Day War, he suddenly dies. in 1969. And Yigal Allon, who we all know, heard of, is a famous general. He basically is the temporary or interim prime minister, and the vote is for her, and she is voted in. It was not a surprise, by the way. This is not like one of those upsets where all of a sudden Lincoln is president of the United States. People knew she was the obvious choice. That's even though she had stepped away. So she takes the position, as she had done so much. She puts her health and her family on the sides, and she goes and becomes prime minister of Israel, and becomes the second leader of a country to be a woman and be in this position. So she, of course, is leader of the combined Labor Party. Interestingly enough, her election at this point, remember, Israeli elections happen whenever they want. I mean, you're elected for 4 years, but if the prime minister dies, it's not like the vice president takes over and you're president for the rest of the term. No, what happens is they have another election, because basically they have an election every 3 days in Israel for some reason. Anyway, this election is oh, thank you, Karen. It was Rachel Cohen Kagan. All right, so who was the other woman who signed the Declaration of Independence. So she won 56 seats for the Labor Party. 56 seats. Right now, the top party gets about 20 seats. So she won, which, even though Labor had been dominating, they never got that. 56, that means you only need 5 seats to have a coalition government to get the 61. So basically, you can pick anybody. So she wins with the largest majority in Israel history, probably something that will never be broken. She helps to end the war of attrition between Egypt and Israel. What is the war of attrition? After the 6-Day War, there was a war, kind of like border skirmishes that continued over and over again. She helped to try and stop that. She went into negotiations to give up the Sinai, to trade the Sinai, but she didn't want to give it all up. And so she tried and failed. She was prime minister during, of course, the Munich massacre at the Olympics, where the Israeli national team and some of their coaches were killed. So she is the one. If anybody saw the movie Munich by Steven Spielberg, she's the one who initiates the Mossad to hunt down and set the example that if you go after Israelis anywhere, we're coming for you. And that is still to this day. She helps bring Soviet, during her time, let some Jews out of the Soviet Union. So she helps them immigrate to Israel. So she does some really good things, but as we know, there's one thing she's going to be known for as prime minister, and that is the Yom Kippur War disaster. So she is prime minister. Moshe Dayan is defense minister until the October 7th attacks recently. This would have been the biggest military disaster in Israeli history. Still is, as Israel was attacked and completely fooled by this. She had been negotiating with Anwar Sadat already, and even though there were signs that they were ready to attack, she was advised by Moshe Dayan and by others that it wasn't going to happen. Although others were on the other side who said they are definitely going to attack Moshe Dayan, and of course General Elazar were thought that they weren't. So even though the thought for full mobilization came up. It was, of course, turned down. And even though they were debating a preemptive strike at the time, because of her negotiations with America, she felt that a preemptive strike would really have serious ramifications on Israel's ability to create connections with America and other places. So she turned that down. And of course, what happens is Israel's attacked. They do survive. They win the war. It is a win. However, it's disastrous for Israel's reputation as a very powerful country. And so after the war, even though her party still won, she stepped down because she was unable to form a coalition. So basically, she steps down in 1974, and she will retire. I mean, she'll retire, and then she'll die a few years later. So she, despite her ill health, she lived into her 80s, which is pretty remarkable because she had a heart attack in her 40s, had cancer in her 60s, seemed like she was having heart attacks often, and was a chain smoker. So, and also with all the pressures of what she was doing all the time. So she retired. Obviously, Yitzhak Rabin would succeed her, and she will be, remembered for what an incredible life she lived. Obviously, her prime ministership was plagued. Her reputation was plagued because of this, which wasn't, was certainly her fault because she's the ultimate person, but obviously she wasn't a military strategist. So it's Diane got also a lot of the blame, as did others, but she was prime minister at the time they were attacked. So if you're going to get the kudos for being prime minister, you're going to get the detraction. So we remember her for being a force, obviously. One of the most famous Jews of all time. And even though the Yom Kippur sullied her reputation a little bit, but really what she did as foreign minister and as labor minister and as part of the Jewish Agency from the 20s all the way to the 70s, and we're talking 50 plus years of service with very little time away. Even when she retired from her job as foreign minister, she was still working with the party. So an incredible person who led an incredible life, a very tough lady. Israel has not had a woman prime minister since, although Israel has had women who've been heads of parties and have been part of the leadership, but really nobody else since that has gotten to that level. Any thoughts or questions about her? I mean, what else is there to say? She's Golda. She was the mother to a people. I mean, she is always going to be considered, the mother of the people of Israel, And so, you just can imagine this is a woman who she's working nonstop, smoking all day, drinking coffee all day. The only exercise she gets is to go walk to her next meeting. Heart attacks, cancer, still lives into her 80s at a time where most people did not live anywhere close to that. So obviously her autobiography has been great sellers. There's been movies about her, TV shows. So basically just an incredible person. And if it hadn't been for the Yom Kippur War, but it's like saying if it hadn't been for World War II, if it hadn't been for the Yom Kippur War, again, she would be considered probably a great prime minister as well. But obviously she is not because of that. All right. So, yes, Flossie.
What
I'm sorry.
happened with her children? Did they ever do anything, go into politics or do anything?
No, unlike the person we'll talk about next. I mean, they did, have lives and do well in life, but she had siblings who moved to Israel eventually, but her sisters, but I don't think her children ever became major. I mean, they had good lives. I don't think they served any capacity. So unlike Begin, who we'll talk about in a second, whose children did. But we have to look because I'm not sure, if what her children did. I forgot, but I can look that up. That's a good question.
Where did she live in Israel?
That's a good question. Time she lived in Tel Aviv. She was almost mayor of Tel Aviv, actually. Time she lived in the kibbutz. But I don't remember where she lived at the end of her life. I mean, obviously, when she was in the cabinet, she was living at times in Jerusalem.
Jerusalem, yeah.
Okay, wait. There you go. Now I remember. One son was a musician. That's one I remember, like a very good musician, like for the Israel Symphony,
Wow.
and was trained in America. But I don't know what the other one did. But I think she lived a lot of time in Jerusalem. But I don't know where she was living when I think she lived in Tel Aviv after she retired. I don't know. It's not as famous as Menachem Begin
Ella Swift, yeah.
lived in Sde Boker. But yeah, somebody should look that up. I don't know where she lived after she retired or when she was living. Well, when she was working for the government, she was most likely in Jerusalem most of the time. But I know she lived in Tel Aviv. They wanted her to run for mayor of Tel Aviv, and she really didn't want to. And I think what happened was she lost because the ultra Orthodox didn't want her as mayor of Tel Aviv. All right, so let's do a little bit. We'll start doing. You want to do a little bit of Menachem Begin?
Okay.
Sure.
I mean, he is also somebody. I mean, we just ran through Golda Meir. We could have stayed on her more. So when you talk about Menachem Begin, you're talking another incredible person who lived a long life dedicated to the state of Israel. So, he didn't live his whole life in Israel, but he lived a long life, even longer than Golda Meir. Is a little bit younger, but he almost reached, how old was he when he died? He was, 80 as well, somewhere around there. I don't know if he reached 80, but he's somewhere around that age. He was about 20 years younger than her.
He was 78. I'm sorry, he was
How old?
78 when he died.
78. So he, of course, is very famous for many things. He was the de facto, eventually called the official person in the Knesset, who was what we would call the minority party or the opposition party. But you have to remember, labor, or what was like labor, Mapai, the different labor groups, was Israel politics for a long time. So from basically start of the country in 1948 till Menachem Begin wins in 1977-ish. So for over 30 years, almost 30 years, one party dominates politics. Even after the Yom Kippur War, they still win a majority. They're still in charge. So in America, that just does not happen. In America, and not in our history, obviously we had the Democratic Party had a very long run with FDR and Truman, but by and large, it's 4 years or 8 years and then the next party. The last time one party was in power for with 12 years was Reagan and Bush. But going back to Eisenhower, it's been 8 years or 4 with that one time where Bush won after Reagan. And just think about us recently. We had last Democrat, Republican, 4 years, then a Democrat for 8 years. Before that, a Republican 4 years. Before that, Democrat 8. So it's been pretty consistent back and forth. But in Israel, for a long time, it wasn't. The Labor Party dominated. Now, of course, the Likud Party has been in charge for not almost as long, but a long time. And that starts with Menachem Begin. So he is born, of course, in the Russian Empire, as everybody else is who's in these positions. His father was a merchant, and unlike Golda Meir, he was a Zionist very early on. Like Golda Meir was a dedicated Jewish person, and then he's a Zionist from an early age. His father was a Zionist. He's studying the Zionist movement. He's learning Hebrew at a young age. He's a member of Hashomer HaTzair, which is the Zionist Scouts, which is, you still see the Scouts come, the singing Scouts. He was part of Beitar, but this is, of course, in Eastern Europe. So he is a Zionist, but is also, from a fairly well-to-do, comparatively Jewish family. So he goes to law school in Poland and is very much a leader and a great speaker. He doesn't practice law, but while in law school, he's already creating self-defense organization for Jews. Remember, at this time in the 30s, Poland was a pretty good place for Jews. As we talked about before, there were a lot of them. So you had a lot of backing. If you're getting in a street fight, you got backing. And Poland was supportive for a long time of Jews moving to Israel. Yeah, of course, World War II brought out the worst of the Poles and the anti-Semitic feelings they had. But Poland was the largest Jewish country in the world by far before World War II. And so as he is in Poland, studying in law school, creating these self-defense organizations, he becomes, in many ways, the protege, as we mentioned, of Zev Jabotinsky, who was part of the National Revisionist Zionist movement. He is, Begin becomes like, not an heir apparent, but a very, very fast riser in this movement. He's really young. It's in the 30s, still in his early 20s, and he's already moving up the ranks of the more radical movement in the Jewish world. So, he's in Czechoslovakia, he's in Poland, he's recruiting, he does get married, he's bringing Poles to Israel, he's trying to bring more of them, he's smuggling them in Israel when it's not allowed. He gets caught in Europe at the beginning of World War II. Thank goodness he is not in Germany. He gets captured by the Soviets, which is bad, but not as bad as it been the Germans. He's a Zionist. He was not. Everybody knew he was. He is a pretty well-known radical Zionist. And so he is thought to be part of a secret agent with Britain. Remember, the Soviets are on the side of the Germans at the beginning of the war. So when that switches over, he's eventually allowed to leave, and he eventually leaves after Germany attacks the Soviet Union, and eventually makes his way to Israel, but he starts fighting with Poland. So after he gets out, he joins the Polish resistant forces fighting the Germans. And so he has to debate. And they're very supportive of the Jews, by the way. The Polish resistant, the ones that were fighting alongside Jews. So to say all Poles were anti-Jewish would not be true. And he has a decision to make. Is he going to fight the Germans with these Polish resistant fighters, or is he going to fight with the Jews in Palestine against the Germans? And he decides to go to Israel. And now he doesn't what's the word when you leave the army illegally?
Oh,
Oh, well,
So he
Dessert.
doesn't desert. Thank you. He doesn't desert. I mean, his commander says, if you want to do this, go do it. So he has very good ties with the Poles, and so he actually asked permission, and he goes and he joins the Irgun, which of course is run. It's the organization helped founded by Jabotinsky. His parents were killed in the Holocaust, and he helps become part of the leadership of the Irgun. And instead of fighting the Germans, he really starts fighting the British. Now, if we remember, we talked about the Irgun after World War II starts. At first, they're supporting, but then they eventually don't believe. The British keep saying, we're going to give you guys a country after the war. And Jabotinsky and Begin are like, we don't believe you. And eventually starts fighting them. Now, when we say fighting them, he is not going to war against the British military. He's attacking the civilian leadership, not the military. He's protesting the what we would call like the city council and those things. And he's not going after the British military because that he knows he's not going to do until after the war is over. So there are limits to what he will do. But after the white paper of 1939, and he just doesn't believe Britain's going to do anything for him. So he really becomes a student of other resistance forces against England. So he studies what they're doing in India. He studies what they're doing in Ireland. He even goes to some of these places to study war tactics on what they could do. His hero is Michael Collins. What can we do to fight a guerrilla war and really cause havoc against Britain? His goal is to make Israel untenable for Britain. He wants to make it expensive for Britain. He wants to make it a place where leaders of Britain don't want to go, both during the war and after the war. So he is attacking Palestinian forces that attack them. He's attacking anybody and helping with illegal immigration during this period, which obviously is very difficult. He is tenuously, he and Begin, Begin and Ben-Gurion obviously did not get along at all. I mean, there were periods where they got along better, but they didn't get along. But there was, during this period, Haganah that worked with Britain was underground, as we told you, supporting the Irgun. And up until probably the ship being bombed we talked about, and the hotel being bombed. I mean, Haganah was not, they worked with Britain at first to find Irgun a little bit, and it really hurt their reputation. But when they realized that the British wasn't going to help them out, they maintained this role of working with Britain, but kind of turning a head to what the Irgun was doing. So when the Irgun bombs, tax offices or shoots policemen, which to us is radical and terrible, and Haganah would officially denounce it, they were not trying to stop them. But after they assassinated the British resident minister, Lord Moyne, and things got really hot, Haganah stopped really supporting them for a while because they were getting a little bit too much into, there's still a war going on. And there's a line that even the Irgun and the Lehi know not to cross, and they crossed it. They don't mind crossing it after the war's over if, when Germany's defeated, but there was a line they kind of crossed a little bit and did with the shooting of police officers. And so they they would help the British find certain people if they're doing too much. But this all stopped after the war's over. You know, it's very obvious Britain's not going to do what they said they were going to do. So the Haganah is supporting Lehi and Irgun behind the scenes. There's unofficial alliances. You know, there's coordinated attacks right up until the King David Hotel, which actually Haganah said was working with Lehi, with Irgun to do it, because this was the headquarters for the British, for their military, for their civil government. And Haganah said, don't do it at the last minute. They did. Not only that, they did it in the section where there were a lot of people during the day when a lot of people were there, killing a lot, you know, almost 100 people. And so that was really one of the defining moments that separate them, as the Haganah did less fighting of the British, and they really concentrated more on bringing people into Israel. Because remember, after the war's over, Britain is blockading Israel. And the Haganah's chief duty was to get Jews from Europe into Israel. And the Irgun, their chief duty became in many ways fighting the British. And it was, you know, there's basically also going on, there's, you know, scattered issues with the Arabs and Muslims living there, because after, you know, the war with Israel doesn't start until May 14th, 1948, when they declare government, but the partition plan is passed in November. And so there's already skirmishes between Muslims and Jews. And during all of these years, late 40s, during the war, and then after World War II, Begin is heading this, but he is a man on the run, and he is an outlaw. I mean, think about, there's posters of him with rewards posted, dead or alive.
Wow.
The British want him badly. So he's hiding everywhere. He's hiding in Arab neighborhoods and Orthodox neighborhoods. The Haganah Times are hiding him. Everybody's hiding him because he is Mr. Most Wanted. And so it's not like he's leading an official army. He's hiding out everywhere. And he's successful. He's never captured. Nobody knew he was mysterious. You know, during this time period, he is not Ben Gurion with his face planted everywhere. People didn't even know what he looked like. I mean, they had like picture maybe from his childhood. They didn't know what he's wearing a beard, and he's basically Mr. Mystery, because they have nobody has a picture of him that looks like him. You know, so they have old pictures, and so I mean that's what he's living. So he's, you know, it's one of these novels where at times the British are about to capture him, and they check every street except for the one street he's on, and they check this house, but he has a secret place in the house, and you know, the police officer, you know, British officer walks right by it and is knocking on it and just doesn't see him there. It's like one escape after the other. And this is who he is for this whole period. So we're talking 5 or 6 years. You know, he's got agents leading people in the wrong directions. You know, he's giving misinformation, so British will go to different places, and everybody thought that he had plastic surgery and he looked like somebody else. I mean, it could be a novel. I mean, it should be. It probably is, and I just never read it. Does
You
anybody?
should write it.
So, and again, but remember, he's a radical. He is a radical, so he is very violent and not very supportive of the Muslims there. And of course, we know what happens. We'll talk later. So we'll end here, and we'll go into the War of Independence next week from his perspective, and we'll go through him and Diane. We already talked about the ship that's blown up. That really is the final straw in uniting the government. Any questions or thought? Because some of you may have met Menachem Begin. And it's also, remember, he was a radical like this up until the moment he became prime minister of Israel and became a statesman. I mean, it wasn't like he got older and more mature and became less of a, he was a radical all the way until he became prime minister. And then so it's interesting to see how things change. So all my best, everybody. We will continue next week as we're going to study a little bit more about Menachem Begin, his period from the very beginnings of the War of Independence up until his retirement from being prime minister of Israel. And then we'll talk about Moshe Dayan. All right, guys, always a pleasure.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Rabbi.
Have
Bye,
a
everybody.
wonderful day. Oh,
Take
just
care,
remember,
everybody.
Take care.
remember this Friday night we have our musical service, or rockin' service with the pre-neg at 5:30, and Saturday I'm gonna have a little sermon about the situation in Israel, and then we're gonna talk about it during lunch. And we have a lot of people with different opinions. We're gonna let everybody give their opinion. Hopefully, we can do it in a good way that is supportive of each other. All right, guys, stay safe, and we will see you.
Bye, everybody.
next week, if not